This guy here killed at least 12 men inside his own apartment, kept the bodies there for weeks, some even for months, lived with those corpses, cooked parts of them, and it wasn't the police who found all this out. It was a clogged toilet on the floor below that unlocked one of the darkest cases in British criminal history. I'm Marcos Campos, and today I'm telling the story of a man who killed at least 12 young men in London between 1978 and 1983. He kept the bodies inside his house for days and was discovered not because the police were after him. Okay, but like I said, it started when a downstairs neighbor's toilet got clogged, it wouldn't flush anymore, and then everything unfolded. But the question, or questions, are how does a career civil servant, a union leader, respected by some, called a troublemaker by others, but the owner of a little dog loved by everyone in the building, become one of the most prolific serial killers in the UK at the time? Why did the police go almost 5 years without noticing anything, even with several victims escaping alive and going to the police station? And what is so unique about this case that more than 40 years later, it is still studied by forensic psychiatrists and biographers from all over the world? Here's what we'll cover in this episode, so stay with me as we dive into the facts. There is a house at number 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. This address is in a very quiet residential neighborhood in the north of London. You know those neighborhoods full of terraced houses with pointy roofs like this and well-kept gardens in front? That kind of street where the neighbors kind of compete to see who has the nicest lawn? Well, number 23 on that street was the exception. The garden was kind of overgrown with weeds, the facade needed a paint job, and inside things weren't much better, you know? At some point, someone had divided that house into 6 studios, let's say, for rent, and maintenance was pretty much non-existent there. The place was managed by a real estate agency from the neighborhood, but the actual owner of the property lived on the other side of the world. Probably one of those people, you know, who buy property as an investment just to rent it out, never even set foot in the place. So in February 1983, 5 people lived in that house. 4 of them were on the ground floor, which included a couple. The woman was a bar attendant and the man was a construction worker, and also 2 young foreign women who shared a room. And upstairs, isolated in the attic of the property, in an apartment that had been adapted from 2 rooms with its own kitchen and bathroom, lived the 5th tenant. He was a 37-year-old man, tall, thin, the kind who walks a bit hunched over with his shoulders forward, you know? He was a civil servant, worked at a government employment assistance office. He left home early wearing a gray suit and came back at the end of the day, actually, in the early evening. He took his little dog for a walk, and that was pretty much it. A really quiet guy who kept to himself. For those who lived downstairs, he was just the guy from the attic, that's all. Quiet, polite, he didn't have many visitors, not much noise. The neighbors from the ground floor had even gone up to his place once to have coffee. That was months before what happened, and I'll tell you about it in a moment. And in that conversation, let's say routine, maybe every day, better said, just a 5 minute chat, they found out that he preferred to be called Dez. So, on Thursday, February 3rd, 1983, a guy named Jim Alcock, who was a bricklayer living on the ground floor, noticed that the downstairs toilet was clogged. He even tried to unclog it with some homemade product, but it didn't work. The next day, which was a Friday, his girlfriend left a note warning the others not to use that toilet. They called a plumber who promised to come on Saturday. So the plumber arrived, tried to fix it with the tools he had, but he couldn't do it either. He said it was a job for a company specialized in that. And there was a company in London at that time, Dynarod, which specialized in unclogging back then. Now, here's a detail that I would say carries some weight in this story. Dynarod showed up on Tuesday the 8th, 5 days after the clogging. And during those 5 days, up there in the attic apartment, that tenant, Dez, who liked to be called Dez, right? He was going through a very sinister and macabre episode. On Sunday, that is 2 days before that Tuesday, right? He was cutting a body into 4 pieces in the living room of his house. He had put the head to boil in a pot on his stove, and the other pieces he put in plastic bags and stored in the closet in the hiding place. And there's the most bizarre detail that only he knew, okay? With each passing day with that clogged toilet, everyone complaining, he started to understand what could really be happening with that clog. He knew very well what he had thrown in that toilet in the last few days, maybe even the last few months. And he knew that sooner or later someone would go down that manhole outside to see what was blocking the whole house's pipe. Well, when the technician from that company, Dino Rod, finally arrived around 6:15 in the evening that Tuesday, since it was winter, it was already pretty dark. But even so, he went down there, checked the pipes, kind of just looked over them and saw that the problem was underground on the side of that house. There was a manhole cover that was kind of cracked there, and it led down to the sewer. The depth of that was about 4 meters. So this professional went down the iron steps there, attached to the wall. Typical of those underground spaces in London, you know? And Jim Alcock, the bricklayer who lived on the first floor, went to give him a hand, some help. He stayed up top holding the flashlight, pointing it down while the professional was going down. And it was during that descent that the plumber noticed there was a strange smell there. When he got to the bottom, the flashlight lit up that weird layer covering the floor. He told Jim to hold the flashlight steady on the object while he took a piece and brought it to the surface for a better look. At that moment, the guy already knew it wasn't excrement, a piece of poop. He was a plumber who already had some experience there. He realized that it was flesh, but he didn't know from what. He became cautious, even though he was starting to have doubts. But he could be wrong, right? Well, that day he went back home, called the company manager, and told him what he had found. The manager agreed that they would go back together the next morning to confirm what was there. And up until then, no police, no alarm, nothing like that. But there's a detail. Before this plumber left, when he was going up the stairs and all, he asked a question that seemed pretty innocent. He asked if any resident of that house had a dog because he said that sometimes, someone might throw something in there. Like raw meat in the toilet, bones, chicken, butcher scraps, and that really can clog it. The resident from the attic who had come down to see what was happening on the ground floor, with everyone talking, he answered without hesitation that he did have a dog, a little female dog. But throwing meat in the toilet, he said never, so the plumber thanked him for the answer and left. And actually, he didn't really suspect anything because of how naturally the guy had answered him. That same night, in the early hours, the neighbors on the ground floor heard something coming down the stairs. They heard the front door open, they heard someone dragging the cover of that manhole, there were some metallic scraping sounds. Then, footsteps along the side of the house heading toward the backyard. The bricklayer's girlfriend even whispered to him that someone was messing with the manhole outside, and she bet it was the guy from upstairs. And it really was. The attic resident had personally gone down to the manhole with his flashlight and a plastic bag in his hand. He picked up whatever he could find down there in the manhole. He threw the pieces over a fence into an empty lot behind the house. His plan was pretty simple. He was going to go early to Kentucky Fried Chicken to buy some chicken pieces with the intention of throwing them into the pipes to confuse the plumber or whoever went there later. But deep down, he had already given up on that plan. He drank rum all night after that. He thought about taking his own life, but ended up giving up on that too. He thought about running away, but that didn't happen either. In the end, he decided to just wait. Was he feeling that something was going to go really wrong for him? Well, the next morning, February 9th, the plumber came back at 9:15 in the morning. He lifted the manhole cover, pointed his flashlight, and the floor was now cleaner. He was stunned. It didn't make sense because not even rain could have washed that away. And he already knew that the toilets were still clogged. So he went down again to take a closer look, stuck his hand into one of the secondary pipes there, and pulled out another piece of meat. 4 pieces of bone came out with it. When the plumber came out of the manhole, the neighbor from the ground floor, the girlfriend of that construction worker, was already outside the house to tell what she and her boyfriend had heard together the previous night. And that's when they decided to call the police to see what was going on. The one who showed up was Detective Peter J. He arrived there around 11 o'clock that morning. He took the fragments that the plumber had found to Charing Cross Hospital, where Professor David Bowen, a forensic pathologist at the University of London, examined everything at 3:30 in the afternoon. So Bowen confirmed that it was human. The flesh probably came from the neck area and the bones were from a man's hand. With this information confirmed then, at 4:30 in the afternoon that day, Detective J was back at that house. And he, along with 2 other colleagues, waited for Des to come home from work. He showed up at 5:40 in the afternoon and that was the beginning of the end. The three police officers went up with him to his apartment in the attic, right? Detective J said he had come because of the pipes. Des looked surprised and asked if they were from the sanitation department. Then Detective J explained that no, they were from the police. That the pieces found there in the sewer of that house were human. Des's reaction was, "Oh my God, that's horrible," but it didn't last long. Jay looked him in the eyes and told him to stop stalling, and he asked where the rest was, the rest of that body. And that's when the guy calmly pointed to his closet in the bedroom and said it was in 2 plastic bags, that he had the keys if they wanted to open it. Jay said they didn't even need to open it, that the smell in there was already enough confirmation. He asked if there was anything else he wanted to say, and the man replied that it was a long story, and that he would need to go back many years in time, and that he wanted to tell it, but at the police station. In the car, on the way to the police station, one of the detectives sat next to him, in the back seat. He asked the question that would be recorded in the British police files, as a turning point. One of the most striking moments of the case. "Are we talking about 1 or 2 bodies?" Des answered without changing his tone of voice. "That there were 15 or 16 since 1978.
Detective Steve McCusker sat in the back seat and I was driving, and I don't know what made Steve do that. But suddenly he asked Nilsen, 'Are we talking about 1 body or will there be 2? And Nilsen said, "Neither. I think there are 16.
In the interrogation room, Detective J had to repeat the question because he thought he had misunderstood. That man was saying he had killed 16 people since 1978. And the man said yes, 3 in Cronley Gardens, that house with the clog, right? And about 13, 12, or 13 at the previous address, on Morose Avenue in Cricklewood. And this man, Des, had a full name, and it was Dennis Andrew Nilsen. Scottish, son of a Scottish mother and a Norwegian father. He had been in the military, had been a police officer, and for the last 8 years he was a civil servant, a competent, articulate guy, known by his colleagues as a combative unionist. The interrogations lasted more than 30 hours during that week. He said everything without being asked, in an uninterrupted and frightening autobiographical monologue. The detectives, experienced men who had already seen a lot in their lives, they were in shock at what he reported, and all of it was delivered with an eerie emotional indifference. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. To understand how this man ended up in that apartment, on that day, with pieces of 3 different people stored in the closet and the kitchen, how he clogged that plumbing with human remains, we need to go back in time to a fishing village in the northeast of Scotland in the winter of 1951. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Frysburg, Aberdeenshire, which is a port city in the northeast of Scotland. His mother, Betty White, was Scottish, and she had been elected Queen of the Town Dance at the height of World War II. His father was Olaf Magnus Nilsen, a Norwegian soldier from the Free Norwegian Forces, who had gone into exile in Scotland after the Nazi invasion. Dennis's parents met on a street in Frysburg when Olaf defended Betty from a drunk soldier who was trying to come on to her. From that casual encounter, they fell in love and they got married on May 2, 1942. They had 3 children, Olaf Jr., Dennis, and Sylvia, but over time, problems arose. The father became absent. He was practically never at home. The family never really became a true family unit. So after a while, Betty moved back in with her parents, and the 3 children grew up in their grandparents' house. The mother and her 3 children shared one room. Mother and daughter had one bed. The 2 brothers shared the other. The house was simple and belonged to Dennis's maternal grandfather, a Scottish fisherman named Andrew White, and in that small, cramped house, the central man in Dennis Nilsen's life was not the absent father nor the overwhelmed mother. It was his maternal grandfather, Andrew White, a fisherman, unionist, informal, religious, fervent, a storyteller. Andrew was the exact opposite of Dennis's biological father. He used to take the boy for walks near the harbor. He taught him how to fly a kite made of paper and branches tied together with string. He took him to see the construction of the boats. He told stories about the sea that he didn't tell anyone else. Dennis was the best listener Andrew had. And for the boy, his grandfather wasn't just a beloved figure. He was the central anchor of his existence. According to Dennis Nilsen himself, he wrote this decades later, in a prison cell. In October 1951, Andrew White was feeling too tired. He had quit singing in the local choir for the first time in his life. He said he didn't have any strength left, but he still needed to work. And the job of a fisherman required a lot of effort. He had to go out to sea, so one day he said goodbye to his family. He waved to his grandson and boarded. That same night on the boat, he refused a cup of tea, something he had never done before. He told his friends he had indigestion. Then he went to lie down in his bunk, and when his companions went to wake him the next day, he was dead. The cause, a heart attack. This happened on October 31, 1951. He was 62 years old, and Dennis at that time was 5 years and 11 months old. Grandpa Andrew's body was brought back to Fryeburg by train, and he was laid out in their own house, right there in the family's room. They placed the open casket on top of sawhorses in the middle of the room. His wife, Dennis's grandmother, cried throughout the entire wake. But no one stopped to explain to the children what had actually happened. Betty, the mother, at some point entered the room and asked if the three children wanted to see Grandpa. She took each one, still in their pajamas, and took them up to the edge of that casket. And here's a detail that Brian Masters, the biographer who spent years studying this case, points out. He identifies this as the pivot point for everything that came after, the link in all of this, the central link. When the boy asked what was happening, the mother said that Grandpa was sleeping. She didn't say that he had died. She didn't use the word death because she was afraid of shocking the child. It was a well-intentioned decision, of course, and according to Nilsen himself, as he wrote in prison, it was the decision that shattered his personality permanently. For months afterwards, the boy kept waiting for his grandfather to come back. No one ever mentioned his name again. It was as if Andrew White had evaporated, and what formed in the mind of that child was a strange equation. If his grandfather had gone to a better place, as they said, why hadn't he been taken along? Why was being dead supposed to be a good thing, but it made everyone cry? And why had his father and his grandfather, both of them, gone away and left him behind, decades later? Writing from his cell in Brixton, Nilsen would say that he spent his entire emotional life searching for his grandfather. That on that day, in October 1951, blinds came down inside him that never went up again, and that deep down, he wanted to be inside that coffin, sleeping alongside his grandfather. His childhood remained lonely. Dennis was a boy who would disappear. His mother even had to lock the garden gate to keep him from wandering off into the street. He would dig under the gate in the dirt and still manage to leave. He described himself as an unhappy boy, brooding, secretive, struck by a sense of inferiority. At 15 years old, he enlisted in the British Army in the Catering Corps, which is the sector responsible for feeding the troops. He served for 11 years as an army cook, going through several battalions, including some of the most respected in the British infantry, which is the Ward and Sutherland Highlanders. He served in several places, including briefly in West Berlin during the Cold War. And it was during this period that he began to realize he was homosexual, a discovery he faced with deep shame in the British military culture of the 1960s. Being gay was a big problem, and in 1972, about to turn 27, Dennis decided to leave the army. He tried to reinvent himself. He joined the Metropolitan Police in London as a recruit, but only lasted a year. That didn't fit him either. He spent a few months working as a security guard in government buildings until he managed in 1974. He got a job at one of those unemployment offices. It was a bureaucratic job, easygoing with a modest salary, and there he ended up settling in. He worked at that kind of office for the next 8 years, always doing the same thing, helping people who came looking for jobs, processing form after form, and it was at that moment during that same period that he discovered the union. He became the employees' representative, then president of the local branch, and in that role he found something that the army and the police and all the things he had done before had never been able to give him: a voice. In meetings, Dennis was sharp, articulate, aggressive in debate. He defended his colleagues against management as if it were his own personal cause. He would take any labor dispute to the very end. His superiors kind of looked down on him. He quickly gained a reputation as a troublemaker too, but his colleagues liked him, okay? At least for now. At work, Dennis was considered a nice guy to be around, very smart, ironic. He knew how to make people laugh. He came up with good ideas in meetings. But it was a specific kind of friendliness, you know? The kind that works inside the office, during work hours, like at the coffee break. But it doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't extend beyond the workplace, let's say. None of his co-workers at the public office had ever been to his apartment to have a beer, to chat. None of them had seen him in a social situation outside of work. He was the kind of person who at the end of the workday would turn his back, grab his coat, and leave. And nobody had any idea what he was going to do or where he was going. He was a good conversationalist, had a lot to talk about. But it was always about work, about the union, about the injustices he was fighting against. Personal confidences, personal conversations. The kind you only have with someone who really knows you, with a close friend. He couldn't talk about that, and he didn't have anyone to do that with him. In 1976, he moved to a ground floor apartment with a garden at number 195 on Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, in northwest London, and he went to that address with a guy with whom he was having a sort of relationship. It actually barely lasted at all. The guy left, and there was Dennis with his dog, Blippy, inside that apartment. He drank a lot, rum with Coca-Cola, listened to a lot of classical music, and opera on his headphones. Elgar, Mahler, Britten Grieg, Tchaikovsky, and some sophisticated pop tracks too, especially one called Superman by Laurie Anderson. It had an almost hypnotic effect on him. He walked his little dog Blippy twice a day in Gladstone Park. He took care of the garden. He seemed to be an ordinary man, living a quiet and ordinary life. But inside his house in 1978, he began to develop a private ritual. And in a very sick way, in front of the mirror, a really bizarre thing. Look, he would cover himself in talcum powder to look pale. He rubbed charcoal around his eyes, painted his lips blue, created fake blood stains on his skin, and lay down on the bed in front of the mirror with his mouth open, letting saliva drip. With a fixed stare, he pretended to be a corpse. He imagined another character in the scene too, an old hermit who found his body in the forest, took it home, washed it, took care of it, masturbated. At the end of 1978, his depression was at rock bottom. His career was kind of stuck because of his union activism. The colleagues he defended didn't support him in return. There was no one to spend Christmas with him. He wrote years later that if he disappeared during that period of his life, no one would even notice. At least not for a week. And then the night comes that flips a switch and changes this whole story. On December 30th, 1978, Dennis Nilsen, on the eve of the new year, was alone as usual. But that day, something was bothering him. He was a bit anxious, tired of staying at home, so he decided to go out. However, instead of going to the gay pubs he usually went to, he went to the Cricklewood Arms, which was an Irish bar near his house, a place frequented by workers. Different from the crowd he was used to. He drank some Guinness, the famous beer over there, right? One after another. In the middle of the crowd, he talked to several people. At some point in the night, he started talking to a guy who was also alone. Actually, he was a teenager, skinny. At some point, the two of them went to Dennis's house. They drank even more, then went to bed together. But nothing sexual happened. In fact, they both passed out, probably wasted. A few hours later, Dennis Nilsen woke up. He looked at the boy sleeping there next to him. In his own words, written years later, he was afraid to wake the boy up, worried that he would get up and leave, afraid of being completely alone again. And the idea of losing that company was unbearable for him. So he looked at the floor, saw his own tie lying there among the clothes, picked up the tie, got on top of the boy, and tightened it. The boy woke up during the strangling and fought back. They both fell off the bed. They rolled across the carpet, knocked over the coffee table with ashtrays and glasses. In about 30 seconds, the young man's body went limp, but the boy was still breathing. Nilsen went to the kitchen, filled a bucket with water, and came back. He hung the boy upside down over a chair there in the dining room. He stuck his head into the bucket, then he waited. With morbid patience, he waited for the bubbles to stop. After that, Nielsen spent a long time just sitting there, maybe in shock, staring at it, and when he started moving again, he began the second act, which was still amazing and disturbing. He filled the apartment's bathtub, carried the body there, and washed it with detergent. Then he put it on the bed, covered it with a sheet, and left the house. Then he bought an electric knife and a large pot at a hardware store. But when he got home, he thought that what was going through his mind was ridiculous, and he ended up not using them. What he did was something else. He dressed the corpse in white underwear and new socks that he had kept in the closet. He lay down on the bed, hugging the body. He tried to have intimate relations with the corpse, but he couldn't maintain an erection when he felt the temperature dropping. In the following days, he removed some floorboards from his house and stuffed the body underneath. 7.5 months later, on August 11, 1979, he dug up, let's say, the body, wrapped it in plastic bags, and burned it in a bonfire right there in his backyard. He put old rubber in the fire as well to mask the smell. Then he crushed everything that was left there into powder and mixed it with the soil in the garden. At the time when Brian Masters published the book Killing for Company in 1985, this guy was still anonymous. He was only known as the young Irishman. This boy, the teenager he met at the pub. I'm going home. And this teenager wasn't even Irish, okay? His parents were, but actually he was born in London. It was only in 2006, 28 years later, that his identity was finally confirmed. When the investigators were reviewing files of missing people and showed a photo to Nilsen, already 60 years old in prison, and he confirmed it. The young man was Stephen Dean Holmes. He was only 14 years old when he lost his life. The story goes that he had gone to a rock concert and was going to catch a bus back to his parents' house. On the way, he ended up entering that pub to hide from the cold. He was heterosexual, liked soccer and rock music, and disappeared that night, December 30th, 1978, without leaving any trace. His mother died in 2002, never knowing what had happened to her son. After that first night, Dennis went almost a whole year without killing again. He went on with his life as if nothing had happened. He worked for the union, walked his dog in the park. On the outside, he was an ordinary citizen, and he himself, according to what he wrote later, even came to believe it, that it had been an isolated accident, that he would never do it again. But then, in October 1979, something happened that should have changed the course of this story, but it didn't. Dennis had taken a Chinese student named Andrew Ho home. At some point during the night, while they were talking about sex, he grabbed a tie and wrapped it around the young man's neck. Ho panicked and managed to break free. He grabbed a candlestick, threw it at Dennis, and ran straight to the police station. The police went to the apartment half an hour later. Ho reported the attempted strangulation. Dennis, very calm, denied everything. He said it was just an act, part of sex. And then came the mistake that cost dearly. Ho, embarrassed to explain to the police what he was doing there, decided not to pursue the case. So the police left and the case was closed. Years later, from his prison cell, Dennis Nilsen himself wrote a sentence that sends chills down your spine. He said it was a shame he hadn't been arrested that night. If the police had investigated that report from that student more thoroughly, all the deaths that followed could have been avoided. But in December of 1979, then came Oakenden, a Canadian tourist who had come to spend his vacation in London. The two met at a pub at lunchtime. Small talk. They hit it off right away. And they spent the whole afternoon together walking around the city. Dennis played the host, showing the tourist spots. At night, they went to Dennis's apartment to continue the conversation. They drank, listened to music. At some point after midnight, with Oakenden sitting there in the armchair listening to a record with headphones on, Dennis took the headphone cable and used it to strangle the young man right there. Then Dennis sat in the armchair next to him, took the headphones from the corpse and put them on himself. And he listened to the entire record, with Ockenden's body, still warm, beside him. Afterwards, Dennis put the body on the bed and spent the whole night with it. The next day, he put it in the closet. The day after that, Dennis left the house, bought a Polaroid camera, and came back. He positioned the body in various poses and took photos. And over the next 2 weeks, he kept taking the corpse out of its hiding place several times. He would sit it in the armchair next to his and watch TV as if it were company. And here comes the detail that made this case different from the others. Oakenden became the only victim. whose disappearance was reported and covered in the British national newspapers. Dennis read those news stories and stayed quiet. Years later, from his cell, he wrote that the death of that Canadian boy hit him like a bomb. From then on, all of this became a pattern. In May 1980, it was Martin Duffy, a teenager almost 17 years old, who had run away from home in the north of England and ended up in London trying to start over. He met Dennis and ended up at the apartment on Melrose Avenue. Dennis's apartment. He was strangled in bed in the middle of the night. In August of the same year, it was Billy Sutherland, a Scot from Edinburgh, known in the area as a heavy drinker. And from then on, things only got worse. There were several others, most of them still unnamed to this day. They were young men, homeless, addicted, people who lived off odd jobs and sometimes prostituted themselves. People without documents, without family waiting at home, with no one to miss them. The last victim at the Melrose Avenue apartment was a man named Malcolm Barlow in September 1981. And this is where the most unsettling aspect of this case appears. Maybe Dennis Nilsen didn't choose his victims with predatory care. Not in the classic sense from the movies. He would invite anyone who accepted to go to his house. Some people went, slept, woke up in the morning, had breakfast, and left alive. Others he simply killed on his own accord. There were at least 7 failed attempts. People who escaped or where he himself came out of the trance before finishing. Some of these people even went to the police in May 1980. A Scottish man named Douglas Stewart escaped and went to the police. The police went there to Melrose Avenue, talked to Dennis Nilsen, heard his side of the story, that it was just a trivial fight between 2 drunk men, and left. They didn't even investigate, and here is one of the links in this criminal chain, because for almost 5 years, victims managed to escape with their lives, went to the police, and were ignored. We can say that the guy who was killing was a successful public servant, articulate, with no criminal record. The people who escaped were young, marginalized, let's say gay, addicts, prostitutes, drunks. The British police in the early 1980s simply didn't take this very seriously. Meanwhile, the garden at the house, there at number 195 Melrose Avenue, kept filling up with ashes. Nilsen would make periodic bonfires, mix the ashes with the garden soil, break the larger bones with a shovel, and throw them over the fence into a vacant lot. Later, when the police dug up the garden in 1983, they would find more than 1,000 bone fragments. According to Dennis Nilsen himself at the trial, there would be 12 men killed on Melrose Avenue, just there, but it could have been more. And years later, in 1992, he changed his story. There was talk of 15, 16 victims, but he said that the total was really 12 at that address and at the next one, which I'll talk about in a moment. But for Detective Peter J., he always thought that this contradiction, this retraction, didn't make sense. But let's look at the other address, the one that opened this episode. In October of 1981, the owner of the apartment on Melrose Avenue, Dennis was told to move out. The owner asked for the house back. Before handing over the keys, he lit one last bonfire in the backyard and burned everything that was left, maybe as evidence. And according to Brian Masters, the author of the book that tells this story, there were at least parts of bodies there that hadn't fully decomposed yet. Afterwards, Dennis took a garden roller and went over the ashes several times, crushing them until they turned to dust that mixed with the soil. Well, after that, he moved to the other side of London, to a neighborhood called Muswell Hill, and rented the attic of an old house, the same one that opened this episode. In his mind, Dennis thought that this move would be the end of the cycle because the new apartment didn't have floorboards he could lift to hide bodies, didn't have a garden he could use just for himself, didn't have any little corner where he could hide or burn things, and for a moment it really seemed like Dennis was right about that. In December 1981, he found a young man named Kevin Sylvester, paralyzed from drinking, on a street. He took the guy home, gave him a bed to sleep in, fed him breakfast, and sent him away alive. And Nilsen wrote that he was euphoric, thinking that finally it was over, that he had left all that behind. But he hadn't. The first death in the new apartment happened in March 1982. A few months after the move, the young man's name was John Rowlett. He was a street guy, one of those who had spent his whole life without a home. His family had cut ties with him when he was still a boy, at 13 years old. Since then, Rowlett had spent his life wandering, going in and out of shelters, getting arrested for petty thefts, never managing to get his life on track. When he met Dennis, he was already an adult, in his early 20s, with that habit of making up stories about himself and his past to seem more important than he was. He would tell anyone that he had been a soldier in the British Royal Guard. Nobody knew if it was true or not, and it probably wasn't. Dennis himself never even learned his last name. To Dennis, he was just John, the guard, and it was with that nickname that the young man's name ended up years later in the case files. The second death at Cranley Gardens came in September of the same year, a man named Graham Allen, and the third victim was on January 26, 1983. And this is the one that matters to understand how everything fell apart. The name of this victim, this young man, was Stephen Sinclair. He was 20 years old, heavily addicted to drugs, and on his wrists, he had recent marks from trying to end his own life. He was the kind of guy that nobody would miss, and it was exactly because of that Dennis chose him, or saw an opportunity in him. In these three deaths at Cranley Gardens, the method of body disposal changed drastically. Since he didn't have a garden to make a bonfire or floorboards to hide the body, Dennis started doing something much, much worse. Maybe he would take the body to the attic bathroom, put it in the bathtub, and dismember it right there. He would cut the organs into small pieces and flush them down the toilet. And when that process became too slow, he would take the larger parts and boil them in a pot on the stove, the whole head in a big pot, then the hands, the feet, and so on. When the bone came out clean, he would break it into small pieces and throw them in the household trash, which the city garbage truck would pick up weekly. And what was left of the bigger bones, like the skull, femur, arm bones, pelvis, he would keep in a chest he had in the corner of the living room, wrapped in bags with coarse salt. He covered all of that with an old red curtain he had brought from his previous apartment, and it was exactly this scheme is what broke the case open, because the attic bathroom's plumbing, as we saw, got blocked and clogged. This pipe ran through the whole house and connected to the sewer down below. The pieces of flesh and fat that Nilsen was flushing down the toilet got stuck and clogged the pipes in January of '83. So after killing Stephen Sinclair, Nilsen was in the middle of the dissection process when the system got completely blocked. On the weekend of February 5th and 6th, he cut the body into 4 parts in the apartment's living room, boiled the head while the downstairs toilet was already blocked and the neighbors were already waiting for the plumber. That's when, as I mentioned at the beginning, the plumbing technician went down the manhole at night. Nilsen was trying to remove the pieces from there. The technician came back the next day. The police arrived. He waited for Dennis to come back from work, and that's how he was finally discovered and arrested. The trial began on October 24th, 1983. 2 large teams were assembled, one for the prosecution representing the British Crown and one for the defense hired by Nilsen's lawyers. The judge who would preside over everything was a veteran in the English judiciary, known for handling difficult cases with a firm hand. Nilsen was charged with 6 murders and 2 attempted murders. The 6 cases chosen by the prosecution were those with sufficient forensic evidence: Kenneth, Keenan, Martin Duffy, Billy Sutherland, Malcolm Barlow, John Hollett, and Stephen Sinclair, the last one. The attempted murders were against Paul Nobes, a 19-year-old student at the University of London who escaped in November 1981, and Douglas Stewart, a 26-year-old man who escaped in November 1980 after Nilsen tried to strangle him while he was sleeping in an armchair. The defense strategy was to plead not guilty and try to prove that Dennis had some form of mental disorder that took away his control over his own actions. If this argument was accepted, he would not be convicted of murder, but of a lesser charge under British law, which would open the door for him to serve his sentence in a psychiatric hospital instead of a regular prison. In practice, this meant he could be released in about 15 years. And then the psychiatrists completely disagreed. The doctors hired by the defense argued that Dennis had a severe personality disorder formed back in his childhood in Freiburg, the unexplained death of his grandfather, the absent father, the fact that he discovered he was gay and had to hide it his whole life, especially in the army. All of this, according to them, created in him a kind of false self, a facade that hid a fragmented mind. But the psychiatrist hired by the prosecution countered this. He said yes, Dennis had an abnormal personality. No one in their right mind would kill so many people. But from a legal standpoint, an abnormal personality is not the same as a mental illness. And what he saw in Dennis's behavior during the crimes was exactly the opposite of someone out of their mind. The guy encouraged his victims to relax, to drink, to sleep. He calculated, planned, and executed with coldness. Abnormal, but with a perfectly functioning mind. The jury was divided, and on November 4th, 1983, by late morning, the judge announced that he would accept a majority verdict. It didn't have to be unanimous. In the afternoon, the result came out. The majority convicted Dennis. In all 6 murder cases and in one of the attempted murders, Dennis was convicted. In the attempted murder against one of the survivors, the verdict was unanimous. All the jurors found Dennis guilty. Go figure. In the end, the judge sentenced Dennis to life in prison with a recommendation to serve at least 25 years before being able to request parole. But in December of '94, more than 10 years after the sentence, the British Home Secretary reviewed the case and changed the rules. He turned the sentence into something called a whole life tariff, which in practice means true life imprisonment, with absolutely no possibility of release, no appeal, no parole, no review. Dennis, he was going to die in prison. And that's when Brian Masters comes into the picture. Brian Masters is the English biographer who, during the period when Dennis was in prison awaiting trial, started exchanging letters with him. It was from this correspondence that the most detailed book about this case was born, called Killing for Company. In a loose translation, it means killing for company, and it was actually the main source for producing this video here. Masters was the only biographer Dennis authorized to write about his story. The reason for the title comes from a phrase that Nilsen himself wrote in one of the letters. He said he killed for company, out of an absolute fear of being left alone so that someone else would stay with him, whether they wanted to or not. Exactly as he wrote about that young man from the first night. On the morning of December 30, 1978, in 2020, more than 30 years later, a British TV channel produced a 3-episode miniseries called Death, the nickname by which Nilsen referred to himself. David Tennant played the main role, and Daniel Mays played Peter J., the detective. And Jason Watkins played Brian Masters, the biographer. The series, written by Luck Neal, focused entirely on the period between the arrest and the trial. It didn't show any of the crimes, which was a deliberate choice not to avoid glamorizing violence. It won awards and had massive viewership. Dennis Nilsen spent 35 years in prison. He served time in various facilities. He learned Braille in the prison workshop and started translating books. He painted, composed music on the keyboard, and read a lot. He wrote an autobiography called The History of Drowning Boy, which is a reference to his own concepts about the tranquility of death. The autobiography was not published while he was alive, but it was released posthumously in 2021, and it was on May 10, 2018. Nilsen was transferred from prison. He was moved from there to a hospital. He was experiencing severe abdominal pain. The diagnosis was a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. Surgery was performed, but he developed a blood clot as a post-operative complication and died on May 12, 2018 at the age of 72. His body was cremated in June 2018 in a service attended by 5 people, 3 prison officers, a person who had corresponded with Nilsen for years, and 1 more person. No family members attended. However, the ashes were handed over to a relative according to the protocol of the British Ministry of Justice, and the prison paid for the funeral expenses. Of the men Dennis Nilsen confessed to killing, 7 remain unidentified to this day. 7 young men who entered some pub in London between the late 1970s and early 1980s met a friendly civil servant, went to his house, and never returned. Their families, somewhere in the UK or or Ireland are probably no longer searching. Some of these families may never have even started looking. And perhaps the coldest detail of this story is the sentence Dennis himself wrote about that first murder years later in his cell. He said he didn't know why he had started, that he had spent his whole life asking himself that question and never found the answer. The person who may have come closest to an answer was Brian Masters. For him, everything went back to that small room in Freisberg in October 1951. The open coffin, the grandfather who seemed to be sleeping, the mother who never said the word death to the 5-year and 11-month-old boy who spent months waiting for his grandfather to return and never managed to understand why death was a better place to which he had not been invited. That's how it was. Between 78 and 83, he invited 12 people, maybe more, possibly 15. This was the Dennis Nilsen special. Hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. A kiss from the redhead. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episode. Bye.